The transport ship landed on the outer platform of Varnock 12, a cold and lonely space outpost near the warfront. Aliens in sharp armor walked quickly across the deck, some with weapons, some with medical crates. No one stopped to greet the new arrival. A tall human man stepped out of the cargo bay. His clothes were plain, worn and dusty from travel. A large cooking bag hung over his shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just looked around quietly. His name was Raylan General Vex. The commander of the outpost looked down from the upper deck. He was a six-eyed Threxian with a wide chest and 3 sharp claws on each hand. He muttered to his aide, "That's the new cook? He looks like he just crawled out of a trash bin." The aide shrugged. "Human records say he's a chef, sir, but not much else. He didn't even submit a resume." "Just said he can cook," Vax sighed. "Great. Another human mystery." He waved his claw. "Bring him to the mess hall." Raylan was led inside the base without saying a word. Soldiers glanced at him as he passed, some with curiosity, others with laughter. The last cook had left after 3 days, crying and puking from the smell of glarn roots. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with smoke and grease. Pots were piled everywhere, and the food machines blinked with red warnings. It smelled like burnt metal and regret. Vax entered with his heavy boots shaking the floor. He looked Raylan up and down. "So, human," he said with a grin. "You talk much?" Raylan looked at him and spoke slowly. "I don't talk much, sir. But I can cook," Vax blinked, waiting for more. But Raylan said nothing else. He just walked over to a corner, opened his bag, and took out a small, worn cookbook with a faded picture of Earth's sky on the cover. Vax snorted. "Fine, you'll cook for the lowest-ranked soldiers. The cleaning crew and waste team." Raylan nodded once. Not insulted at all. He tied his apron and got to work. He asked no questions, used no machines, just started chopping, peeling, boiling, and mixing. Aliens nearby watched with confusion. Some laughed when he gently stirred soup with a wooden spoon. One alien janitor named Thura sniffed the air. "Why does it smell warm in here?" she whispered. At mealtime, Raylan placed bowls of his soup on the metal counters. The soldiers looked at it, simple, brownish, not glowing, not steaming weird colors like usual rations. A reptilian crew member tasted it first. He paused, blinked, then slowly finished the bowl in silence, then got another. Others followed. And within minutes, the room was oddly quiet. Not because they hated the food, but because they were eating, slowly, carefully, like something sacred was in the bowl. General Vax was in his command office reviewing reports. "Sir," said his aide, barging in. "You should come down to the kitchen." Vax frowned. "Is the human choking on a root?" "No," the aide replied. "The crew is asking if he's staying." Permanently, Vax's eyes widened. That had never happened before. He walked down to the mess hall and found half his cleaning crew sitting peacefully, eating like they were home. Raylan stood in the corner, arms crossed, eyes calm, watching everyone eat, saying nothing. Vax walked up to him and tasted a spoonful from the leftover pot. And for a moment, Vax remembered something he hadn't felt in years. His childhood, his mother's tent on the Threxian plains, the scent of boiling moss root stew, the warmth, the peace. He slowly put the spoon down and stared at the human. "You made this?" Raylan simply nodded. Vax rubbed his jaw, then chuckled. "You really don't talk much, do you?" Raylan replied softly. "Food talks better than I do." That night, the cleaning crew slept deeper. A soldier with a minor wound felt less pain. One old janitor who hadn't laughed in years told a joke at bedtime. And no one noticed that Raylan had stayed behind in the kitchen, cleaning every pot by hand, humming a quiet earth tune under his breath. He wasn't just a cook, he was something else, something peaceful in a place built for war, and this was just his first day. The next morning on Varnock 12 felt different. The air wasn't warmer, and the gray skies outside still looked dead and cloudy, but the soldiers walked with less heaviness in their steps. Raylan had already been in the kitchen since before sunrise. No one told him what to cook, no one had to. He worked quietly, chopping, slicing, stirring, like he had done it 1,000 times before. His hands moved fast but never rushed. He used ingredients the aliens thought were useless. Bits of dry root, leftover bone broth, powder from the inside of a cracked nutrition cube. But when the pot started boiling, the smell filled the hallway again. Sergeant Kriv, a giant, red-scaled alien who usually never smiled, came in with a limp. "You got more of that?" "Soup, human?" he asked. Raylan nodded, handing him a steaming bowl. Kriv sat down at the corner bench and ate slowly. After a few minutes, he blinked and flexed his injured leg. Huh, he muttered. Feels better already. By the time the morning alarm rang, half the crew had come down to the kitchen, not for orders, not for meetings, but for breakfast. They didn't just eat. They talked, laughed, leaned back like it was the first real meal they'd had in years. Some even asked Raylan questions, though he barely answered with more than 2 words. General Vax watched the hallway camera feed and scratched his chin. This isn't normal, he said to his aide. Sir, the aide replied. The night patrol reported higher alertness, faster reflexes, and less fatigue. After eating the human's food, that's impossible, Vax grumbled. We're not talking about medicine. We're talking about soup. Yes, sir, but maybe the human knows something we don't. Vax stood and grunted. Fine, move him up. Let's see what happens if the officers eat his food. Later that day, Raylan was moved to the officers' mess. A cleaner, more advanced kitchen, but still unused since most officers relied on military rations. He didn't react to the promotion, just unpacked his tools again, cleaned the dusty counters, and began preparing dinner without being asked. This time he made something different. A thick stew with soft, fragrant layers topped with hand-shaped herb dumplings. The smell drifted through the vents into the strategy rooms above. Commander Renix, a cold-blooded officer who always ordered from the protein dispenser, sniffed and froze in place. His nostrils twitched. His stomach rumbled. By evening, a full table of officers sat waiting for Raylan's dish. Some of them looked uncomfortable. They weren't used to being served like this. Raylan didn't bow, didn't explain anything, just placed bowls in front of them and stepped back. At first bite, the room went silent. Commander Renix's claws stopped tapping. A female commander with silver feathers blinked slowly and whispered, "It tastes like home." Another officer looked around, then wiped a tear without even realizing it. I haven't felt this full in years, he said, and not from food. General Vax arrived halfway through the meal and sat down. He didn't say anything either, just ate, eyes narrowed. Thinking hard later that night, he called Raylan into his office. You're changing the soldiers, Vax said, folding his arms. They act different after your meals. Raylan stood still. Silent. Vax narrowed his eyes. You using earth drugs in that food? Raylan shook his head slowly. No, sir. Then what is it? Raylan thought for a second, then answered. I cook what they need. Not just what they want, Vax grunted, confused. That sounds like something from a fortune cookie. Raylan didn't reply. Vax sighed and leaned back in his chair. You're not just a cook, are you? I'm just a man who's seen too much war, Raylan said quietly. And I know soldiers don't just bleed from wounds. They bleed from the inside. Vax looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Fine, you'll stay in the officer's kitchen for now. But if I find out you're using mind tricks or illegal spice, I'm not, Raylan said. You'll see. Days passed, and the base felt warmer somehow, not physically but in energy. Fewer fights, fewer sick calls. Even the maintenance crew started singing while they worked. Rumors spread that Raylan's food had healing in it. Some called it magic. Others said Earth's soil had secrets no alien ever understood. But Raylan just kept cooking. One night, a young alien soldier came to the kitchen in tears. Her brother had died in a skirmish the day before. She hadn't eaten since Raylan served her a small bowl, gently placed a napkin beside her, and walked away. She ate slowly, then sobbed. Not from sadness, but from something warm she couldn't explain. In the back of the kitchen, Raylan turned the page of his old notebook. A small earth recipe was written in shaky handwriting. For broken hearts, start with warmth, end with peace. He smiled quietly, and began boiling water for the next batch. The aroma from the officer's kitchen had reached every corner of Varnock 12. Even the outer patrol squads asked for leftovers to be delivered during cold night shifts. One message from a scout team simply read, "Send soup." Morale low, Raylan didn't respond to the praise. He didn't smile, didn't brag, just kept cooking quietly, like always. But not everyone was happy about his growing fame. Deep in the upper deck, Chef Krelix watched the screen with narrowed yellow eyes. His long silver whiskers twitched with rage as he scrolled through daily kitchen reports. He was the official head culinary director of the outpost, trained in 11 planetary cuisines, winner of 3 intergalactic flame awards, and personal chef to a warlord once, and yet, all anyone talked about now was the silent human. What has he done? Krelix growled, slamming his clawed hand on the table. Turned boiled roots into religion? His assistant tried to calm him. Sir, maybe. We can learn from him. His recipes seem to learn from him. Krelix snapped. He's a primitive stew stirrer. He doesn't even use molecular binders. He stood abruptly and stormed toward the officer's kitchen. Pushing open the heavy steel doors inside, Raylan was slicing something quietly, steam rising from 3 open pots. Krelix stopped at the entrance and raised his voice. Human. Raylan looked up calmly, waiting, saying nothing. You think you can replace me with simple soup? Krelix sneered. Let's see how your human hands handle pressure. I challenge you to a duel, the kitchen staff gasped. An alien food duel wasn't just cooking, it was performance, skill and public judgment. And failure meant exile from the culinary corps. Raylan didn't blink, didn't flinch, he simply asked when. Tomorrow, Krelix said, turning. In the Hall of Iron Taste, bring your best human and prepare to lose. Raylan nodded once. Works for me. The word spread like wildfire. Soldiers cleaned up early just to get seats. The engineering crew converted the central cargo bay into a stage. 2 massive cook stations stood side by side. With lights and hollow cameras ready to record, General Vax didn't stop it, in fact. He leaned forward in his chair when he heard the news. Let the people watch, he said. We'll see if the human is real. Or just lucky. The next day, the hall was packed. Rows of aliens from every rank filled the benches. Some held ration bars. Betting on which chef would win, on one side, Krelix stood in his golden cooking robes carrying a full set of custom plasma knives. His ingredients floated in jars, colorful, exotic, and glowing, imported from 6 systems. On the other side, Raylan stood in his usual simple apron, holding a battered old knife and a small wooden box of earth spices. His ingredients sat in a crate, roots, dried herbs, bones, mushrooms, and stale bread. The clock started. Krelix moved like a machine, flames danced. Blenders screamed, oils hissed. He used all the latest gadgets, sprinkling powders with scientific precision. Raylan moved slowly, silently, boiled water, crushed garlic, chopped onions, a hand-stirred roux he dropped in mushrooms, added broth from his homemade jar, and tore pieces of bread into thick dumplings. 30 minutes passed, and both stations filled the hall with powerful smells. Krelix's dish sparkled. It was a bright pink swirl with floating cubes and silver flakes. Raylan's was darker, a thick stew with dumplings and deep earthy notes. General Vax stood and signaled the panel of tasters. First, they tried Krelix's dish. The first judge bit down and smiled, a shock to the tongue. Sharp and clean, the second said. Flavor explodes, powerful, but artificial. The third nodded slowly. Precise, but cold. Then they tasted Raylan's. The first judge took one bite and froze, her eyes widened. I remember my brother, she whispered. We used to share something like this on cold nights. The second put down his spoon and just said, Peaceful, the third judge cried. Silently, tears rolling down his blue skin. The entire room went quiet. One alien from the back shouted, What is this food? Raylan didn't answer. General Vax walked forward and raised his hand. The winner is the human. Krelix's face turned pale green. He didn't argue, didn't protest, he just lowered his head and walked away. Defeated, Raylan didn't smile, didn't cheer. He simply started cleaning his station. As the crowd began to leave, one young soldier whispered, That food made me feel like I wasn't in a war, another said. He didn't cook for taste. He cooked for the soul. Back in the kitchen later that night, Raylan wrote something new in his notebook. When war fills mouths with ash, feed them warmth, and remind them they're still alive. He tucked the notebook away, stirred the next day's broth, and let the silence return. The kitchen was quiet again. The duel was over. The crowds had returned to their barracks, but the memory of the taste still lingered in their minds like the echo of a melody. Raylan stood alone by the stove, steam rising from a new pot of soup. He didn't celebrate his victory, didn't mention it at all. It was just another day, another meal, another breath in a place filled with war and silence. General Vax came down late that evening. Not in uniform, not with guards, just wearing a dark coat. He entered the kitchen without a word, sat at the back table and waited. Raylan saw him, nodded, and placed a bowl in front of him. Vax sipped slowly, letting the warmth fill his chest. Then he looked up. You fought a duel, and didn't smile once. Raylan shrugged. It wasn't about the duel. Then what was it about? Vax asked, raising a brow. Raylan wiped his hands on a towel, then walked over to the far wall. He pulled out a small, worn leather pouch from inside a metal drawer. Inside was a folded paper book, old and cracked. He placed it gently on the table beside the general. Vax leaned forward and saw strange handwriting. Earth script, what is this? The general asked. Recipes, Raylan said quietly. Old ones from my family, and from people I met during the war. Vax turned the pages. Each one had notes in the margins, messy scribbles, underlines, and words like for cold nights, when she's crying, after the funeral, and don't forget the salt this time. These aren't just food instructions, Vax muttered. Raylan nodded. They're memories, feelings, things I didn't know how to say out loud. He paused, then added, During the fall of Europa, I wasn't a soldier, I wasn't a hero. I was just a cook in a refugee camp. Vax looked at him carefully. Europa was a slaughterhouse. Raylan nodded slowly. It was. We had no medicine, no power, and no answers. But I had food. Old earth ingredients, broken pots, some salt and spices. I couldn't stop the war. Couldn't bring back the dead. But I could make children forget the sound of bombs. Just for 5 minutes. The general sat back, looking at the book. You kept all of it. Every detail I did, Raylan said, because in war, when nothing makes sense, food still can. One page caught Vax's attention. It was titled, For Soldiers Who Lost Too Much. The ingredients were basic. Bone broth, dark mushrooms, black pepper, a splash of lemon juice, and 2 drops of vinegar. What's the vinegar for? Vax asked. Raylan replied. To make them cry without knowing why. The general chuckled, but it was a heavy sound. You're not just feeding bodies, human. You're healing something deeper. Raylan said nothing. He just packed the book back into its pouch, slid it away, and returned to the stove. That night, a strange request came through the command center. A transport ship carrying wounded soldiers was delayed in a storm. They needed comfort fast. Vax looked at the map, then made a decision. Send them to our station. But sir, his aide said, we don't have enough med pods for all of them. We have Raylan, Vax replied. The storm hit the station hard. Lightning crackled outside the shields, the power flickered, and the wounded began arriving, bruised, burned, silent with pain. Raylan didn't panic, didn't rush. He lit up the kitchen with backup flame lamps and started preparing the recipe from that page. For soldiers who lost too much. He chopped the ingredients by hand, boiled them slowly, added the lemon juice at the end, and waited until the smell reached every hallway. One by one, the wounded were guided into the dining bay. They were given no medicine, no beds, just bowls of hot soup. Some cried, some fell asleep at the table, some whispered names of people long gone, and Vax stood in the corner watching. His soldiers weren't being healed by machines, but by something older, something human. Later that night, he found Raylan scrubbing pots again. You ever think about going back to Earth? The general asked. Raylan shook his head. Earth doesn't need me. Then why do you stay here? Raylan paused, then said, Because war always forgets to feed the soul. I don't, Vax didn't reply. He just nodded slowly and walked out, leaving Raylan alone again back in his notebook. Raylan wrote one more line under that old recipe. Still works even after all these years. 3 weeks had passed since the wounded transport ship arrived. Since then, Raylan had become more than just a kitchen worker. He was now a silent legend inside Varnock 12. But legends bring attention. One morning, a sleek black vessel arrived at the station. Its surface shimmered with strange markings, bearing the seal of the Galactic Ambassadors Council. General Vax stood at the landing platform with his arms crossed. A tall figure in gold armor stepped out. Her name was Envoy Cerexa, a political observer with cold eyes and a voice like polished ice. I've come to inspect the human, she said plainly. We've received unusual reports. Vax tried to keep calm. He's a cook. Nothing more. Soldiers are skipping medical appointments, Cerexa continued. They're lining up for soup, not injections. Some are questioning the war, dreaming of peace. You think that's normal? Vax said nothing, but his jaw clenched. Cerexa walked through the corridors, eyes scanning everything. When she reached the dining bay, she paused. A group of hardened soldiers were eating in silence. Their shoulders relaxed, their faces soft, like children in a safe home. And then she saw him, Raylan, pouring broth into bowls one by one, still wordless, still gentle. Later that evening, Cerexa called a private meeting with Vax. This human is dangerous, she said. He's infecting your troops with softness, He's feeding them what they need, Vax replied. Not just in the stomach, but in the soul. Sirexa's voice sharpened. That kind of softness weakens an army. I've never seen the station run better, Vax shot back. Less violence, faster response. More loyalty. But the envoy had already made her decision. Effective immediately. I'm placing a restriction on all non-standard ingredients. All spices, earth-based items, and handmade meals are banned. You'll return to synthetic rations. Vax slammed his fist on the table. You can't do this, I already have, Sirexa said, standing up. If he violates this order, he'll be removed. Word spread through the station like fire. Raylan said nothing. He simply walked into the pantry, looked at the empty shelves, and sat down for a long time. His notebook sat open in front of him. Recipes stared back, lifeless without ingredients. But the next morning, the kitchen lights flicked on, and Raylan stood behind the counter again. Soldiers blinked in surprise. Didn't they ban your supplies? One asked. Raylan nodded, but said nothing. He placed bowls in front of them anyway. The food was different. No rich spices. No homemade broth, just boiled roots, stale grain, and warm water with tiny scraps of flavor. Yet when the soldiers tasted it, something still felt right. One whispered, "How does it still make me feel? Safe?" Because Raylan hadn't just served food. He had served memory, care, and presence even without ingredients. His touch turned empty bowls into something comforting. That evening, Sirexa returned, expecting an empty kitchen. Instead, she found a full room with soldiers eating in silence and peace. "You're defying a direct order," she said, approaching Raylan. Raylan turned to her, holding an old metal ladle, and replied softly, "I didn't break your rule, I used what's allowed." Sirexa narrowed her eyes. "Then how is it still working?" He looked at her, eyes calm and tired. "Because kindness isn't in the spice. It's in the hand that stirs the pot." The envoy clenched her teeth. "You're clever for someone who barely speaks." Raylan just shrugged. "I cook." That night, someone tried to sabotage the kitchen. A hidden claw ripped through the pantry wall, shredded the last of the root bags, smashed his water boiler, and left a message scratched in the steel. "Leave before you ruin us all." Raylan arrived early the next morning and saw the mess. He didn't get angry, didn't shout. He sat down, took a breath, and then quietly began cleaning one by one. Soldiers and staff entered the kitchen and saw the damage. They stared at the broken shelves, the spilled powder, the ruined supplies, and without being asked, they picked up brooms, grabbed cloths, and began helping. Even Sergeant Kriv, usually cold and silent, stood next to Raylan and muttered, "They can break your pantry, but not your place." By midday, the kitchen was clean again, but there was still no food left. Raylan opened a secret compartment beneath the stove and pulled out a tiny metal tin. Inside were crushed earth herbs, his last forbidden ingredient. He held it for a long time. Then he walked to the pot and dropped in a pinch. That night the soup was simple but magical. Sergeant Kriv took one sip and leaned back, smiling. "This reminds me of when I first joined the army." Before the anger, another whispered, "I dreamed last night." And it wasn't of blood. General Vax, standing in the shadows, finally understood. This wasn't about rules or flavors, it was about memory, about home. And no envoy or law could ever ban that. The warning came at midnight. Varnock 12's outer sensors screamed with red flashes. Enemy ships had broken through the outer defense net. A surprise attack from a rogue faction known as the Skarn Blades. Brutal and fast, General Vax rushed to the command deck. His voice sharp, "Shields up. Call every squad to stations, deploy the fighters now." Across the base, soldiers jumped from bunks. Armor slamming into place, weapons charging, hearts racing. But not everyone was trained for battle. Many were engineers, medics, kitchen staff, and transporters, and Raylan, the cook. He was in the kitchen when the lights turned red. The soft hum of boiling broth was drowned by alarms. But he didn't panic, he didn't run, he just stirred the soup one last time and closed the lid. Outside, explosions shook the walls. Laser fire cracked through the skies. Screams echoed down the corridors. Smoke began creeping in, thick and sour. Raylan walked calmly through the chaos, carrying one large pot between his arms, a folded cloth over the lid to keep it warm. "Where are you going?" someone shouted. "To the wounded," Raylan said softly. Medical bays were already full. Bodies lined the walls, some bleeding, some groaning. Some just lying still with wide, empty eyes. Doctors ran in all directions, but they were out of supplies. And the med pods were full. Raylan entered quietly, set the pot down, and began pouring. He didn't ask who was hungry, didn't wait for permission. He just lifted spoon after spoon, hands steady while the world around him shook. One injured alien took a sip, and exhaled like breath had returned to him. Another cried silently, holding the bowl as if it were gold. Even the doctors paused, watching. "What is this?" one whispered. Raylan didn't answer. He just kept serving, and something happened. The wounded began to sit up straighter. Some blinked with clarity. Others reached for their weapons. Trying to stand outside the line was breaking. Skarn soldiers breached the eastern wall. Blaster fire ripped through steel. Enemy troops flooded the halls. The kitchen lights flickered and the air turned heavy. Raylan didn't stop. He grabbed empty pots, scraped the last scraps from every corner of the pantry, and mixed something new. He boiled bones, used crusty bread, melted old nutrition bars, anything he could find. Soldiers who had lost all hope tasted his food and stood again. Some limped back to the fight, pain dulled, minds clearer. One even said, "I thought I was dead until I tasted that." A desperate call came through the radio. "They're at the inner gate. We can't hold them." General Vax growled, "We're out of options." His second-in-command turned. "There's one thing left, sir. The human." Vax blinked. "The cook?" The officer nodded. "He's keeping people alive without medicine. He's feeding courage into the broken." Vax made the call. "Protect Raylan at all costs." Back in the dining hall, the walls trembled with distant blasts, and still, Raylan stood with his pot, pouring, stirring, feeding Sergeant Kriv, blood dripping from his arm. Reached for a bowl. "Give me double, human. I've got one more round left in me." Raylan gave him triple. An engineer ran in, coughing. "The lower corridor's breached. They're coming here." People panicked, some cried, some froze. But Raylan stayed calm. He stepped forward, carrying his last pot, and moved toward the sound of the incoming enemy. "What are you doing?" someone shouted, but Raylan didn't answer. He walked through smoke and fire, down the corridor toward the breach. And when the first Skarn soldier turned the corner, weapon raised, he stopped there. In the middle of the ruined hall stood a human, alone. Holding a steaming pot of soup, Raylan said nothing. He simply ladled some into a bowl and placed it gently on the floor. The Skarn blinked, confused, aiming his blaster, then paused. The smell hit him, deep and earthy, warm and familiar. It reminded him of something he didn't know he had lost. The other enemy soldiers slowed. Hesitated. Raylan stood still, calm, quiet. His silence said more than 1,000 war speeches ever could. And for a moment, just one moment, the hallway went still. General Vax and his soldiers arrived seconds later, ready for blood, but found the enemy, lowering their weapons, confused, shaken, uncertain. In that breath of silence, the humans struck, pushed them back, and sealed the corridor. Victory wasn't won with guns that night. It was won with soup, with warmth, with the quiet courage of one man who never raised his voice. Varnock 12 was quiet again. The smoke had cleared, the fires were out. The broken walls were patched with steel and memory. But no one at the outpost would ever forget what happened during the night of the surprise attack. They didn't talk about the enemy ships or the number of kills, or even the final push that saved the command center. They talked about the soup, about the human who stood alone in the corridor with nothing but a steaming pot, and somehow stopped a war. Raylan didn't take credit. The next morning, he was in the kitchen again, boiling water, slicing roots, quietly humming a melody no one else knew. General Vax watched him from the doorway, arms crossed, silent for once. After a long pause, he stepped inside and placed something on the counter. A small medal, dark silver, with the seal of the Outer Ring Defense Force. Raylan looked at it, then looked back at his pot. "You've earned more than this," Vax said. "They want to promote you, send you to the capital, maybe even offer you a galactic award." Raylan stirred the pot gently, then replied, "I'm not leaving." Vax blinked. "Why?" Raylan glanced around the kitchen. "Because the stove's still warm, and someone's going to need breakfast." Vax chuckled, rubbing his forehead. "You're impossible," but deep down he was relieved. News of Raylan's actions spread across the systems, not in loud broadcasts or shiny headlines, but through whispered stories between soldiers, ship crews, and tired medics who remembered the taste of peace. They called him the flame that fed the front. Others called him the quiet healer, and some simply said, the cook. At the refugee camps, people requested Earth-style meals. Even though they'd never been to Earth on mining colonies, workers tried boiling broth with scraps, hoping to feel what the stories described. And on distant warships, soldiers wrote letters home saying, I tasted something today that reminded me of before everything went wrong. One day, a child from the lower decks came to the kitchen on Varnock 12. She held a cracked bowl and said softly, "Can you make the thing that makes dreams come back?" Raylan didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded, filled the bowl, and handed it to her with both hands. She took a sip, smiled, and whispered, "I remember my mom's laugh now." He said nothing, only nodded. Envoy Cerexa, the same official who once tried to ban his ingredients, returned quietly a month later. She didn't come with guards or threats, only a small package. She approached Raylan in the kitchen, holding out the box. "I'm not here to fight," she said, "just to say thank you." Raylan opened the box and found a tiny glass jar inside. Inside it was crushed starroot, one of the rarest earth spices, banned in most war zones for being emotionally volatile. "I pulled strings," Cerexa said quietly. "It's not on any record, don't tell anyone." Raylan gave a small smile for the first time, and nodded. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Your food made me dream again," she whispered. I hadn't done that in years, and then she was gone. Raylan went back to stirring his pot, steam rising like a prayer. He didn't need awards or fame, or his name written on plaques. He just needed a warm fire, a pot, and people to feed. One night, as the stars shimmered above the outpost and the soldiers sat around the mess hall, bowls in hand, someone asked him, "Raylan, if the galaxy ever ends, what will you do?" He thought for a moment, then said softly, "Start it again, with bread and broth." That line was written down in a soldier's diary, copied in books, and eventually carved into the wall of the officer's kitchen. Generations later, when the wars had long ended, and the outposts turned to peace hubs, the kitchen on Varnock 12 was preserved. No one changed the pots or cleaned off the burn marks on the stove, and in the center of the room a bronze statue stood, not of a warrior, not of a king, but of a man holding a ladle, with soft eyes and an apron covered in stains. At the base of the statue, the words were carved, "I don't talk much, but I can cook."